England, September 1944. The rain fell in sheets across the muddy grounds of Camp Kempton, turning the afternoon sky into a slate-grey ceiling that pressed down without mercy. Lieselotte Brenner stood perfectly still as 3 British soldiers approached her children. 9-year-old Friedrich, 6-year-old Anna, 4-year-old Klaus. The soldiers spoke in polite tones she couldn't understand, gesturing toward a waiting lorry. Her children looked back at her with eyes that asked questions she couldn't answer. She watched them climb into the vehicle, small fingers clutching canvas sides. The lorry pulled away, carrying them into rain and mist. 2 days later, what returned would rewrite everything she thought she understood about enemies. Lieselotte's story began 8 months earlier in January 1944, when the transport ship carrying her from occupied France to internment docked at Southampton Harbour. She was 29 years old, widowed, mother of 3 children who had never known anything but war. Her husband had fallen at Stalingrad in 1943. She had worked as a translator at a Wehrmacht supply office near Strasbourg, managing documents while raising her children alone in a country that was being systematically dismantled. The Reich's propaganda had told her what to expect from the British: cruelty, vengeance, treatment befitting enemies who deserved punishment. She had prepared her children for the worst, had taught them to be silent and compliant and invisible. Instead, the processing at Southampton was bureaucratic and thorough, but not brutal. Documents examined in duplicate, medical screenings, cataloguing of every personal detail. Officials who looked exhausted rather than vengeful. A system designed for efficiency rather than retribution. Then the trains north. Hours of travel across a countryside that seemed impossibly green. Through villages that hadn't been bombed, past fields that weren't scarred by artillery. Alongside British citizens who stared at the German prisoners with wariness more than hatred. The children pressed their faces against windows, watching this strange enemy country pass by. Friedrich asked questions constantly. Where were they going? Why were all the buildings intact? When would they see father? Lieselotte had no good answers. She only knew they were heading to Surrey, to a place called Camp Kempton, where German prisoners were held for the duration. Camp Kempton sprawled across 520 acres of English countryside. Originally built to house Belgian refugees, it had been converted in 1943 to accommodate the growing number of German prisoners captured in North Africa and Italy. By 1944, it held over 2,100 men in the main compound, and in a separate, smaller facility, 63 German women and their children. The women's section was different from the men's. Smaller barracks modified to accommodate families, with partitioned sleeping areas for children. A makeshift classroom where the older children learned basic subjects from whatever teachers could be found among the prisoners. A kitchen where women prepared meals using British military rations supplemented by root vegetables they grew themselves. Lieselotte and her children were assigned to Barrack 4. They shared the space with 5 other families, 19 people total in a building designed for 10. Privacy was a fantasy. Personal space was measured in feet. But they had cots. They had food. They had safety from air raids and starvation and the chaos of Germany's disintegration. The children adapted faster than Lieselotte expected. Friedrich made friends with other German boys, played improvised football in the small yard allocated for recreation. Anna helped in the kitchen, learning to make British-style porridge that tasted strange but filled stomachs. Klaus, too young to understand imprisonment, simply existed in the moment, finding joy in small things, worms that emerged after rain, puddles that reflected sky. Lieselotte watched them adapt and felt something complicated. Relief that they were surviving, guilt that they were surviving in enemy captivity, confusion about what survival meant when your country had lost everything. In August, diphtheria swept through the camp. It started with the children in Barrack 2, spread despite quarantine efforts, moved through the women's section with the inevitability of all bacterial disease in close quarters. Friedrich was first in their family. Fever, sore throat, the distinctive grey membrane forming across his tonsils. The camp physician, a British lieutenant named Cavendish, examined him, prescribed isolation and fluids, explained in simple English that Lieselotte barely understood that Friedrich would likely recover, but needed careful watching. 3 days later, Anna fell ill, then Klaus. Within a week, all 3 of Lieselotte's children were sick simultaneously, their small bodies burning with fever, while the membrane spread across their throats like slow suffocation. Lieselotte didn't sleep. She sat beside their cots, wiping faces with damp cloths, coaxing them to drink water they didn't want, watching their breathing for signs of the complications Cavendish had warned about: airway obstruction and cardiac failure, the ways diphtheria could transform from illness to death. The camp medical facility was overwhelmed. 23 children sick, 5 critically so. Cavendish and his 2 orderlies worked around the clock, but resources were limited. This was a prisoner of war camp, not a hospital. Medical supplies were allocated for wounded soldiers, not childhood diseases sweeping through internment facilities. On September the 9th, Klaus's fever spiked to 104 degrees. His breathing became laboured. Each inhalation a struggle against the membrane closing his airway. She called for Cavendish, her broken English barely coherent through panic. Cavendish examined Klaus, and his expression shifted to something grave. "This child needs hospitalization, proper medical facilities, not what we have here." Lieselotte understood perhaps 1 word in 4, but she understood the tone. Her son was dying. Cavendish made a decision. He contacted the camp commandant, requested emergency authorization to transport 3 German children to the civilian hospital in Guildford. Not just Klaus, Friedrich and Anna too, because their conditions could deteriorate rapidly, and separating them from their brother would be both cruel and medically unsound. The request went up the chain of command, to the camp commandant, to regional military administration, to bureaucrats who had to weigh Geneva Convention obligations against public perception of giving German prisoners access to British civilian medical facilities. Approval came back within 7 hours. Transport authorised. The children would go to Guildford Royal Hospital. They would receive care commensurate with their medical needs. And Lieselotte would not be going with them. The regulations were explicit. German POW mothers could not accompany children to civilian facilities. Security concerns, liability issues, the simple impossibility of guarding prisoners in public hospitals. The children would go with medical escorts. The mother would remain at camp, would receive daily updates, would be reunited with them upon their recovery and return. Cavendish explained this through an interpreter, one of the other German women who spoke better English. Lieselotte listened and felt the ground disappear beneath her. "Nein," she said in German. "Nein, I must go with them. They are babies. They need their mother." The interpreter translated. Cavendish's expression was sympathetic, but immovable. "I'm sorry. The regulations are clear. Your children will receive excellent care, but you cannot accompany them." Lieselotte tried to argue, tried to make them understand that Klaus was 4 years old and would be terrified in a strange place with strange people speaking a language he didn't understand. That Friedrich had night terrors and only calmed when she held him. That Anna would be brave and silent and internalize her terror until it manifested as something worse than diphtheria. But regulations were regulations. At 15:30 hours on September the 10th, an ambulance pulled up to the women's compound. 2 medical orderlies prepared to load 3 German children for transport to Guildford. Lieselotte carried Klaus, too weak to walk, burning with fever, his small body limp in her arms. Friedrich walked beside her, trying to be brave, tears running silently down his face. Anna held Lieselotte's hand with a grip that was painfully tight. At the ambulance, Lieselotte had to let go, had to place Klaus on the stretcher, had to release Anna's hand, had to watch Friedrich climb into the vehicle without her. The orderlies were gentle, spoke in soft tones, but they were strangers. British strangers. Enemy strangers. The children looked at her through the ambulance's back window. Friedrich's face was pressed against the glass. Anna was crying now, silently, hopelessly. Klaus was too sick to understand what was happening, but his eyes searched for her with the instinct of a child who knows safety lives in mother's presence. The ambulance pulled away. Lieselotte stood in the English rain and watched until it disappeared, until mist obscured even the memory of its passage. She returned to the barracks and collapsed on her cot, staring at 3 empty beds, at the toys her children had made from scraps and imagination, at the evidence of their existence in a space that was suddenly horribly vacant. That evening she didn't eat, didn't speak, lay curled on her side while the other women tried to offer comfort in whispered German and awkward touches on her shoulder. Their sympathy was genuine but useless. Her children were gone, taken by the British to some unknown place for reasons she understood intellectually but couldn't accept emotionally. She was a prisoner. Her children were prisoners. And now they were separated by miles and language and the cruel arithmetic of regulations that prioritized procedure over a mother's need to protect her children. Guildford Royal Hospital occupied a Victorian complex on the town's western edge. Built in 1886, it was modern by contemporary standards. Electricity, plumbing, actual medical equipment beyond what military field hospitals could provide. The staff had been notified of the incoming German children. There had been discussion. Some nurses objected to treating enemy nationals when British boys were dying in France. Others pointed out that children were children regardless of their parents' nationality. The hospital administrator made the final decision. The children would be admitted and treated according to medical necessity, with guards posted to ensure security and prevent any public relations disasters. Friedrich, Anna and Klaus were placed in a private room, not out of luxury, but practicality. Keeping German patients separate from British patients avoided uncomfortable situations. 2 guards were stationed outside, rotating shifts, present to ensure the children didn't escape, though where 3 sick children would escape to was left unspecified, and to prevent any incidents. The head nurse assigned to their care was Margaret Thornton, 47 years old, veteran of 19 years in nursing. She had seen everything from industrial accidents to infectious disease, had developed the professional detachment necessary to function in medicine, approached patients as problems to be solved rather than people to be emotionally engaged with. She entered the room expecting to find 3 enemy children who needed clinical treatment. Instead, she found 3 terrified kids who were burning with fever and crying for their mother in a language Thornton didn't understand. Friedrich tried to be brave. At 9, he had internalized that boys don't cry, that showing weakness was shameful, but his face was flushed with fever and tears he was desperately trying to suppress. Anna, 6 years old, had given up on bravery. She sobbed continuously, clutching a cloth rabbit that was falling apart, calling for her mother in increasingly desperate German. Klaus, 4 years old, was too sick to be scared. He lay in the bed, barely conscious, his breathing laboured, his small chest working too hard for too little air. Thornton stood in the doorway and felt something crack in her professional armour. These weren't enemy soldiers. These were sick children who had been separated from their mother and deposited in a strange place where nobody spoke their language. She took a breath, walked to Klaus's bed first. Medical triage. Treat the critical case before the stable ones. She placed her hand on his forehead, felt the heat radiating from him, and understood that this child needed immediate intervention or they would be writing a very different kind of report. The next 36 hours passed in intensive care. Klaus received antitoxin, intravenous fluids, constant monitoring. His fever broke on the 2nd day, slowly, grudgingly, but definitely breaking. He opened his eyes and looked at Thornton with confusion but without fear, too young to understand nationality, seeing only someone who was trying to help. Friedrich and Anna improved more quickly. Their fevers dropped, Their throat membranes began clearing. Their strength returned in increments. But the psychological distress remained. They spoke to each other in rapid German, their conversations anxious and circular. Where was Mama? When would she come? Why had the British taken them away? Thornton couldn't answer. She didn't speak German, but she understood fear when she saw it, understood the particular anguish of children separated from their mother. On the evening of September 11th, Thornton did something that violated hospital protocol. She sat on the edge of Anna's bed and sang. Not in German, she didn't know German songs, but in English, a lullaby her own grandmother had sung to her 40 years earlier. Lavender's blue, dilly dilly, lavender's green. When I am king, dilly dilly, you shall be queen. Anna didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Understood that this strange British nurse was trying to offer comfort. She quieted, listening, and eventually fell asleep, clutching her falling-apart rabbit. Friedrich watched this interaction. The next morning, he approached Thornton and said in carefully practiced English, "Dankeschön, thank you." Thornton felt something inside her shift permanently. That evening, Thornton approached Dr. Edmund Hayes, the paediatrician overseeing the children's care. She found him in his office reviewing charts, looking as exhausted as everyone felt. "Doctor, we need to talk about the German children." Hayes looked up. "Their conditions are improving. Klaus should be clear for discharge in 4 days. The other 2 sooner." "That's not what I mean." She pulled up a chair, sat down uninvited. "They're terrified. They're in a strange place with strange people. They don't speak English, and they're asking for their mother constantly. This is causing psychological distress that's inhibiting their recovery." Hayes set down his pen. "I'm aware, but their mother is a POW. She can't be brought here." "Why not?" "Security concerns, regulations, the usual reasons." Thornton leaned forward. "Doctor, with all due respect to security concerns and regulations, those children need their mother. Not for some sentimental reason, for legitimate medical reasons. Stress and fear suppress immune function. They'll recover faster with their mother present. You know this." Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "Even if I agreed, which I'm not saying I do, getting authorization to bring a German POW to a civilian hospital would require going through multiple levels of command. It's not a simple request." "Then start requesting. Make it a medical recommendation. Document that maternal presence is clinically indicated for optimal patient recovery." Hayes studied her. "You're putting your neck out rather far for enemy children." Thornton met his eyes. "They stopped being enemy children the moment they became my patients. Now they're just children, and they need their mother." Hayes considered this. Then he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. The formal request went to the hospital administrator, who forwarded it to the military liaison, who contacted Camp Kempton Command, who had to clear it with regional military government authority. The bureaucracy moved with surprising speed, perhaps because the request was unusual enough to prompt actual decision-making rather than automatic denial. On September the 12th, authorization came through. Lieselotte Brenner, German POW, would be transported to Guildford Royal Hospital under armed guard to be with her children during their recovery period. Duration, as long as medically necessary. Security, 2 guards present at all times. At Camp Kempton, Cavendish delivered the news to Lieselotte through the interpreter. She didn't understand most of his explanation. She only understood. "You will see your children tomorrow." She wept. The other women wept with her. This impossible thing. This mercy she had not expected. This breach in the wall between captor and prisoner. The lorry arrived at the camp at 0900 hours on September the 13th. Lieselotte had been awake since before dawn, had washed her face and hands a dozen times, had smoothed her prisoner's dress until the fabric couldn't get any smoother. The drive to Guildford took 75 minutes. Lieselotte sat in the back of the lorry with 2 guards who didn't speak German and tried to make herself small and unobtrusive and acceptable. She stared out at the English landscape, green countryside that looked nothing like Germany, dotted with hedgerows that seemed impossibly orderly, shimmering with rain that turned everything soft. At the hospital, she was processed through security, assigned an identification badge, briefed on rules she barely understood through an interpreter who had been hastily recruited from Guildford's small German expatriate community. Then she was led to the second floor, to a private room at the end of the hallway, to a door where 2 armed soldiers stood beside. Thornton was waiting inside. She gestured to the 3 beds where 3 children lay, in various states of consciousness and recovery. Lieselotte stopped breathing. Her children. Here. Real. Friedrich saw her first. He sat up in bed, his face transforming from sick anxiety to shock to overwhelming relief. "Mama!" Anna turned at her brother's voice, saw their mother, and began crying so hard she couldn't form words. Klaus was asleep, but Lieselotte moved to his bed first. Maternal triage, check the youngest, the most vulnerable. She placed her hand on his forehead. The fever was gone. His breathing was easy. He was recovering. Then she gathered Friedrich and Anna, pulled them against her, held them while they clutched at her clothing and sobbed and spoke in overlapping German, expressing everything they couldn't say in the 2 days of separation. Thornton watched from the doorway, tears running down her own face. The guards watched with expressions that suggested they had not expected their duty to involve witnessing this kind of raw emotional reunion. Lieselotte stayed with her children constantly for the next 4 days. She slept in a cot beside their beds. She helped Thornton with their care, learned basic English medical terms through necessity and repetition. She sang them to sleep at night with German lullabies that made the British nurses pause outside the door, listening to music in a language they were supposed to hate, from a woman they were supposed to see as enemy. Klaus's condition improved dramatically with his mother present. He ate better, slept better, responded to treatment better. Friedrich's night terrors stopped. Anna began smiling again, tentatively at first, then with something approaching her old personality. The hospital staff noticed. The correlation between maternal presence and patient improvement was impossible to ignore. Thornton documented it meticulously, noting every metric that showed the children were recovering faster than projected. Dr. Hayes reviewed the data and felt validated in his decision to approve the request. "Medical science," he wrote in his report, "sometimes requires decisions that transcend standard protocol. The presence of the mother has demonstrably improved outcomes for all 3 patients. On September the 17th, Dr. Hayes declared the children medically cleared for discharge. They would return to Camp Kempton, all of them together, accompanied by their mother. Before they left, Thornton gave Anna something, a new rabbit, shop-bought with glass eyes and a real velvet dress. Anna stared at it with disbelief. Why would a British nurse give a German child an expensive gift? Thornton knelt down to Anna's level. "Because you needed something beautiful," she said. The interpreter translated. Anna hugged the rabbit, then impulsively hugged Thornton. The nurse hugged her back. This enemy child. This little girl who reminded her that war made enemies, but children were still children, regardless of the flags their parents served. Back at Camp Kempton, the story spread. The German mother whose children had been taken to a British hospital. The British nurse who had demanded the mother be brought to her children. The reunion that had transcended regulations and nationality. The other prisoners heard it as evidence that the British, despite being enemies, were capable of unexpected mercy. That the propaganda about British cruelty had been lies designed to make Germans fight harder. The British Guards heard it as evidence that maintaining humanity during war was possible. That regulations existed to serve people rather than the reverse. That sometimes the right thing was obvious, even when the rules said otherwise. In October, as the camp prepared for eventual repatriation of prisoners, Lieselotte received something unusual. A letter from Thornton. It had been delivered through official channels, approved by censors, translated by the camp interpreter. Dear Mrs. Brenner, I hope this letter finds you and your children in continued good health. I wanted you to know that caring for Friedrich, Anna, and Klaus was one of the most meaningful experiences of my nursing career. They reminded me why I entered this profession: to heal, to comfort, to help, regardless of circumstances. I know you and your children will eventually return to Germany. I hope you find your country rebuilt and at peace, offering your children the future they deserve. I hope Friedrich continues to be brave, Anna continues to smile, and Klaus continues to grow strong. Tell them that Nurse Margaret will always remember them. Tell them that in England, they have someone who wishes them well. With warm regards, Margaret Thornton, RN Lieselotte, kept the letter folded carefully, stored with the few possessions she was allowed to maintain. She read it through the interpreter multiple times, trying to understand how an enemy could write with such kindness. She wrote a response, though she wasn't sure if it would be delivered. Dear Nurse Margaret, thank you for everything you did for my children. Thank you for seeing them as children first. Thank you for demanding I be brought to them when regulations said I could not. You saved more than their bodies. You saved them from fear that would have scarred them permanently. I was told the British were cruel. You showed me the British were people who could choose compassion when convenience would have been easier. I will tell my children about you for the rest of my life. I will teach them that enemies in war can be friends in humanity. With gratitude I cannot fully express, Lieselotte Brenner. The letters crossed through military postal systems. Two women from enemy nations communicating about children and healing, and the possibility of seeing each other as human, despite the context that said they should be adversaries. Repatriation began in December 1944. The war in Europe still raged, but arrangements for civilian prisoners to return to occupied Germany commenced. Lieselotte and her children were scheduled for transport in early January, from Dover to Hamburg, then whatever awaited in occupied territory. Before leaving Camp Kempten, Lieselotte was given something unexpected: a package delivered through official channels containing 3 items. For Friedrich, a leather-bound book, Treasure Island in German translation. The note: for a brave boy who will grow into a man who reads, may you grow up in a world where adventure is found in books, not battlefields. For Anna, a music box with a porcelain ballerina, bright colours that had been impossible to find in wartime Germany. The note: for a little girl who is brave when being brave was hard, may you dance in a world where children don't have to be brave like that anymore. For Klaus, a wooden toy soldier, hand-carved and painted. The note: for the littlest patient who recovered because his mother was there, remember that love is stronger than regulations. Each gift was signed, Margaret Thornton and the staff of Guildford Royal Hospital. The children clutched these gifts on the journey home, through the train ride to Dover, the boat crossing to Hamburg, the displaced persons camp where they waited for documentation, the eventual settlement in a town outside Heidelberg, where Lieselotte's distant relatives had survived. Germany was shattered. Cities in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, the population traumatized and defeated. Lieselotte and her children joined millions of others trying to rebuild lives from fragments. But they had something others didn't. Evidence that enemies could be kind, that nationality didn't determine humanity, that even in war's aftermath, there were people who chose compassion over cruelty. Friedrich became a translator, eventually working for the British consulate in Hamburg in 1962. He brought his children to Guildford, showed them the hospital where he had been treated, told them about Nurse Margaret, who had demanded his mother be brought to his bedside. Anna kept the music box her entire life, eventually passing it to her own daughter, with the story of the British nurse who gave gifts to German children because children deserved beautiful things regardless of what war their parents had fought. Klaus, who had no conscious memory of the hospital but had been told the story repeatedly, became a physician. He specialized in pediatrics, worked in Munich, treating children who had been traumatized by various modern crises, always remembering that he existed because a British nurse had prioritized his need for his mother over the regulations that said prisoners were prisoners first and people second. Thornton and Lieselotte corresponded for 27 years. Letters crossed the channel regularly. Becoming more than just updates, they became friendship, forged in the impossible moment when war made them enemies, but circumstance made them allies in protecting children. Thornton visited Germany in 1963 during a tour of the continent. She detoured to Heidelberg, met Lieselotte in person for the first time since the hospital, met Friedrich and Anna and Klaus as adults with their own lives. They sat in Lieselotte's small flat drinking tea, communicating through Friedrich, who now spoke fluent English, talking about that September in 1944, when everything had been terrible and uncertain, but humanity had somehow prevailed anyway. "You saved my children," Lieselotte said. Thornton shook her head. "I just demanded that regulations not separate you from them. You saved them. A mother's love did that." "No," Lieselotte was firm. "A mother's love could do nothing if you had not fought to make room for it. You chose to see us as humans. That choice mattered more than you know." They embraced. Two elderly women who had been on opposite sides of history's worst conflict, now united by shared memory of choosing compassion when hatred would have been easier. Margaret Thornton died in 1978 at age 81. Her obituary mentioned a long career in nursing, her service during the war, her dedication to pediatric care. It did not mention 3 German children in the Guildford hospital, the mother she demanded be brought to them, the way she had chosen humanity over protocol. But her family knew, and they told the story at her funeral. How Nurse Margaret had looked at enemy children and seen only children. How she had fought regulations that separated mothers from sick kids. How she had demonstrated that healing requires more than medicine. Lieselotte Brenner died in 1981 at age 66. She died in Heidelberg, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, having rebuilt a life in a Germany that bore no resemblance to the one that had collapsed in 1945. Her last words, according to Friedrich, were in English, a language she never fully mastered, but learned enough of to say, "Tell Margaret I kept her letter. Tell her I never forgot." The letter was found in Lieselotte's effects. Folded so many times the creases had worn thin, the paper fragile from decades of handling. Friedrich kept it, eventually donated it to a museum documenting the British POW experience, where it sits now behind glass. Evidence of an impossible friendship. The story of Lieselotte Brenner and Margaret Thornton became part of the historical record. Researchers studying POW treatment during World War II cite it as an example of how individual acts of compassion could transcend systemic enmity. Military historians reference it when discussing the evolution of Geneva Convention implementation. But the deeper meaning isn't in academic analysis. It's in the simple fact that 2 women, placed on opposite sides by history, refused to let that placement define their humanity. That a nurse saw sick children and demanded their mother be present, consequences be damned. That a prisoner learned enemies could be merciful, even kind. That sometimes, in the midst of humanity's worst impulses, individual humans choose to be better than the systems they're trapped in. The hospital room where it happened has been renovated multiple times. Nothing remains of the space where Lieselotte was reunited with her children. But in Guildford Royal Hospital's archives, there's a photograph. Lieselotte sitting beside 3 beds, Friedrich and Anna on either side of her, Klaus asleep in her lap. A British nurse standing behind them, hand on Lieselotte's shoulder. The photograph was taken by one of the guards, unauthorized, technically a violation of security protocols, but he took it anyway, understanding instinctively that he was witnessing something that mattered more than rules. 2 days after British soldiers took 3 German children away from their mother, they brought her to them. That simple reversal, taking and then giving back, represented everything complicated about war, occupation, and the possibility of maintaining humanity when circumstances conspire to strip it away. The regulations said separate them. The regulations prioritized security over maternal presence, proper channels over immediate need. But one nurse said no, one doctor agreed, one bureaucratic chain of command chose to authorize mercy over procedure, and 3 children recovered surrounded by love instead of isolation, learned that enemies could be kind, carried that lesson forward through decades of life that would not have existed if regulations had been followed without question. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is break the rules that keep people from being human to each other. Sometimes what happens 2 days later rewrites everything you thought you understood about who your enemies are. And sometimes the impossible seems impossible until someone decides to make it happen anyway.